Hey everyone, welcome to my channel where the strange, the unexplained, and the downright creepy come to life. From real-life encounters with the paranormal to bizarre, true stories that'll keep you up at night, I bring you the eerie tales you won't hear anywhere else. If you're into late-night chills, mysterious happenings, and things that go bump in the night, you're in the right place. Subscribe, buckle up, and let's dive into the unknown. It was my third night staying at my grandparents' place when the familiar creak of settling would change. Subtly at first, then unmistakably, into something else entirely. A wheeze, a rattle, as if the walls themselves were struggling for air. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed an accusatory red. 23:11. Every room beyond the bedroom door felt like a lung, slowly collapsing. My grandfather had mentioned it once, years ago, in passing. Something about how the house got temperamental at night. How it was best to stay put once you'd settled in for the evening. I dismissed it then as the eccentric rambling of an old man grown too attached to his routines. Now, 3 weeks after his funeral, alone in the house I'd inherited along with my grief, I understood why he'd spoken of it as if it were alive. The air conditioning unit hummed its familiar tune, but something felt wrong. The temperature hadn't changed, yet my skin prickled with a different kind of cold, the kind that seeped from the inside out. My throat tightened as I lay in the narrow bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that resembled a grasping hand. That stain had been there since childhood, but tonight, it seemed to pulse with each beat of my heart. I'd been staying here for 3 weeks, sorting through decades of accumulated memories, deciding what to keep and what to let go. During the day, the house felt normal, worn, but welcoming, filled with the gentle mustiness of old books and lavender sachets. But every night at exactly 11:11 something shifted. The air would grow thick and syrupy, making each breath a conscious effort. The familiar sounds of the house, the settling beams, the humming refrigerator, the distant traffic, would all become muffled, as if heard through water. My pulse quickened as I remembered the first night I'd experienced it. I'd been in the kitchen, making myself a late snack, when the sensation hit, like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The simple act of walking from the kitchen to the bedroom had become a marathon. Each step required tremendous effort, my lungs working overtime to extract oxygen from air that seemed to have lost its substance. I barely made it to the bedroom before collapsing onto the bed, gasping like a drowning man breaking the surface. The second night I was more prepared. I made sure to be in the bedroom well before 11:11, watching the clock with the intensity of a bomb technician. As the minutes ticked over, I felt it again, subtle at first, then overwhelming. Even with the bedroom door closed, I could sense the heaviness settling over the rest of the house like a suffocating blanket. But tonight was different. Tonight, curiosity, always my weakness, was gnawing at me with renewed intensity. What exactly happened out there? Was it truly dangerous or merely uncomfortable? My rational mind insisted it was probably just anxiety. Grief manifesting in strange ways. My subconscious creating phantom symptoms to match my emotional state. But my body knew better. My body remembered how my chest had constricted, how my vision blurred at the edges, the metallic taste that flooded my mouth as I struggled to breathe that thickened air. The clock now read 23:47. Whatever phenomenon gripped the house had been in effect for 36 minutes. My curiosity burned hotter than my fear, a dangerous combination that had gotten me into trouble more times than I could count. I told myself I would just crack the door, just take a quick peek to see if there was anything visibly different about the hallway. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The brass was cold against my palm, colder than it should have been in the summer heat. I turned it slowly, wincing at the soft click of the mechanism engaging. The door opened barely an inch. Immediately, I felt it, that crushing weight pressing against the narrow opening, trying to force its way into my sanctuary. The hallway looked normal. The same family photos lined the walls. The same worn carpet stretched toward the kitchen. But the air shimmered with an almost imperceptible density, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. I held my breath and opened the door another inch. The pressure increased instantly. My chest began to tighten. That familiar sensation of my lungs forgetting how to function properly. I could taste copper on my tongue. My vision began to tunnel at the edges. This was exactly what had happened the first 2 nights. But now I was experiencing it by choice, conducting my own twisted experiment. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, heart hammering against my ribs. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the air conditioning, and my mouth had gone dry as parchment. But along with the fear, I felt something else, a perverse satisfaction. I'd proven to myself that it was real. Whatever it wasn't some grief-induced hallucination. It wasn't just anxiety. Something genuinely inexplicable was happening in this house every night. The next evening, I prepared more thoroughly. I positioned myself just inside the bedroom door, gathering my courage like armor. I'd spent the day researching everything I could find. Unusual atmospheric phenomena, electromagnetic fields, even infrasound. Frequencies that could cause physical discomfort. Low hums, infrasound, electromagnetic interference. None of it explained what I was experiencing, but the research had given me a framework. A way to approach this scientifically, rather than surrender to superstition. At 23:10, I stood with my hand on the doorknob, counting down the seconds. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out the house's usual nighttime symphony. When the clock flickered to 23:11, I felt the change immediately, even through the closed door. The air pressure in the bedroom shifted, subtly but unmistakably, as if the house were holding its breath. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The sensation hit me like diving into deep water. My ears popped, and that crushing weight settled over my chest with renewed intensity. But this time I was ready for it. I forced myself to take slow, measured breaths, resisting the urge to panic. Each inhalation was a struggle, like breathing through wet concrete, but I stayed upright. The hallway stretched ahead, deceptively normal. I took a step, then another. The pressure increased with each movement away from the bedroom, as if the house was warning me back. By the time I reached the living room entrance, my vision was swimming and my legs felt like lead. But I could see into the room now, and what I saw made my blood freeze. The furniture had moved. Not dramatically, just enough to be wrong. The coffee table sat at a slightly different angle. The armchair had rotated a few degrees toward the hallway, as if something had been sitting in it, watching the bedroom door. The TV remote lay on the floor beside the couch, though I distinctly remembered placing it on the armrest. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe I'd misremembered. Maybe the house had shifted. Maybe the cleaning lady I'd hired had moved things and forgotten to return them exactly. But deep in my gut, I knew none of that was true. The sofa, my grandfather's ancient, brown leather monster, still sat in its usual position against the far wall. Or at least it appeared to. Something about its placement tugged at my mind, just out of reach. I stepped into the room, forcing myself forward against the oppressive atmosphere. My lungs burned. Sweat slid down my spine despite the chill lodged deep in my bones. The sensation of being watched sharpened. The hairs on my neck stood at full attention. Then I saw it. A gap. The sofa had moved forward, just an inch, maybe less, but enough to create a narrow space between its back and the wall, where none had existed before. In that space something glinted. A reflection. Streetlight bouncing off what looked like glass or metal. Curiosity overrode instinct. I forced myself deeper into the room, each step a monumental effort. My heart pounded. Black spots danced at the edge of my vision. But I had to know what was behind the sofa. I was 3 feet away when it happened. The sofa slid. Not slowly. Not gradually. It moved with a deliberate, fluid motion that spoke of intent rather than accident, exactly 1 hand's width forward. The sound of leather skidding across hardwood echoed through the crushing silence. The gap vanished. The sofa now pressed flush against the wall. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that it had blocked my way back to the hallway. It sat at a new angle now, subtly shifted, but just enough to narrow the passage I'd come through. What had been comfortably wide was now barely shoulder width. And as I stared, breath catching in my throat, the sofa shifted again. Just a millimeter. Just enough to make the space tighter. My breaths came quick and shallow. The atmosphere thickened, impossibly so. My vision tunneled. I was trapped. In a room where the air felt like syrup, where the furniture moved with malevolent intent. I stumbled toward the narrowing passage, pressing myself to the wall. I tried to squeeze through. The sofa moved again, another millimeter. Then another. Each shift was subtle, but together they were undeniable. The passage was closing. Terror surged through me. Adrenaline roared in my veins. My hands shook uncontrollably. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. The metallic taste returned, stronger than before, coating my tongue in the flavor of fear. My legs threatened to buckle. I tried to push past the sofa, to force my way through. But my oxygen-deprived muscles had nothing left to give. The more I tried, the more the sofa responded, moving inward, inch by inch. I was caught in a slowly contracting vice. That's when I remembered my grandfather's voice. Not the words about the house being temperamental. Something else. A story he'd told me when I was very young, about respecting the house, acknowledging its moods, about asking permission, not taking liberties. The realization hit like a blow. This wasn't malfunction or hallucination. This was something that required appeasement. Something that demanded to be acknowledged. Pride warred with desperation. My rational mind resisted what I was considering. But as the sofa shifted once more, and the shadows thickened at the edge of my vision, survival instinct took over. Cleared my throat. The sound came out as a rasp. The words felt absurd. Insane. But I said them anyway. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I shouldn't have come out here. I should have respected the rules." Nothing happened. For a long moment the silence pressed in. The house keeps a calendar of its own, marking time not in days or months, but in manifestations that return with an unnerving regularity. Every October the rituals begin anew. I should have left after the first year, when I found him standing silently on the staircase. I should have fled after the second, when the transparent cats began their endless prowling along the skirting boards. But by the third year, when my dead grandmother started her quiet, ceaseless muttering in the kitchen, I understood with crystalline clarity that leaving was no longer an option. The house had chosen me. I had become part of its cycle. The first sign always came in September. A subtle shift in the air that prickled my skin without cause. The walls began to creak in unfamiliar rhythms, as if trying to communicate. Floorboards I thought I knew intimately groaned in new, deliberate patterns. The furnace clicked on with a sharpness that made me flinch. The pipes behind the plaster whispered, not with the benign breath of old infrastructure, but with something closer to anticipation. It was like the house was waiting. Year one introduced the man on the stairs. It was late October, and I couldn't sleep. The air had that thick, restless quality that pressed against your skin, convincing your heart to beat too fast. I got up to pace the hallway, hoping movement would drain the static from my limbs. The staircase descended into a dense blackness, each step vanishing into a deeper shadow. And there, motionless on the seventh step, stood a man with his back turned to me. He didn't move, didn't breathe. He simply existed there, as if he always had, a silhouette carved from the dark. I froze, unsure if I was seeing a ghost or sleepwalking into a dream. I whispered a cautious hello, but he gave no reply. When I dared to step closer, the air grew heavier, like walking into a pocket of underwater silence. My ears rang. My vision pulsed. I backed away. By morning, the staircase was empty again, but a faint indentation remained on the seventh step, as if a weight had rested there all night. The following year, the cats arrived. They were almost invisible, like heat distortions rippling through the corners of my vision. Their forms shimmered as they prowled along the baseboards, tails flicking, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. I tried to dismiss them as stress-induced hallucinations, but they left footprints in the dust. Once, I stepped into the kitchen and found all the cupboard doors hanging open, each one rattling slightly, and the faint impression of paw prints covering every surface. That October, I learned to move slowly, to never step on a tail I couldn't see, and to whisper apologies when I accidentally disturbed their path. The third year brought my grandmother. She had been dead for nearly 2 decades, but there she was, standing at the stove, endlessly stirring a pot of invisible soup. Her lips moved constantly, uttering a low stream of murmurs I couldn't quite make out. I never dared get too close. Her eyes didn't blink. Her skin was gray and soft like damp paper. I once tried to speak to her. She didn't stop stirring, but the muttering paused for a beat, just long enough for her to glance at me with recognition and disappointment. From then on, I kept my distance. Each October, the manifestations returned, growing more familiar, more elaborate. By the 5th year, I no longer tried to resist them. I adapted. The man on the stairs never climbed higher than the 7th step. The cats had territories I learned to respect. My grandmother never left the kitchen, and I learned not to interrupt her. Eventually, I began to see the house for what it was. Not haunted, but alive. A structure with memory. A building with rituals. Every October was its version of breathing, exhaling the memories, the remnants, the ghosts that made it whole. And I, chosen or trapped, had become part of that breath. Now, as September settles in again and the air thickens with that first shimmer of anticipation, I do not brace for terror. I prepare like one lights candles before a storm. I clean the 7th step. I leave out a bowl of cream for the cats. I set an extra place at the table near the stove. The house remembers, and so do I. Some homes shelter the living. Others host the past. Mine does both. And every October, it reminds me that I am no longer just a resident. I am a caretaker of its strange, sacred rhythm. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at his perfectly still form, dressed in what looked like a charcoal suit that absorbed the faint light filtering in through the hall window. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. Stress from the new job, the move, the isolation of living alone in a house too large for one person. But when I blinked hard and looked again, he remained. Exactly where he had been. Not moving up. Not moving down. Simply there, trapped in that strange, liminal space between floors. My mouth went dry. I forced myself to speak, but my voice came out cracked and fragile, brittle with nerves. "Hello," I called out. Nothing. He didn't turn. Didn't flinch. Didn't acknowledge me in any way. I stood frozen in place, watching his silhouette remain unervingly still, until exhaustion drove me, reluctantly, back to bed. At dawn, the staircase was empty. For the rest of October, he returned nightly. Always the 7th step. Always facing away. Always clad in that same light-drinking suit. My sleep fractured. I developed the compulsive urge to check the stairs at odd hours, just to confirm his presence or his absence. I started to dread twilight. Dark circles bloomed under my eyes. My hands began to tremble so badly that holding a cup of coffee became a calculated risk. My coworkers began to notice. They asked if I was sick, if I needed time off. I brushed them off with vague assurances. But the truth was simple and terrible. I was being worn down by something that refused to acknowledge me, yet refused to leave. Then came November 1st, and just like that, he was gone. No farewell. No fade-out. The stairs were simply vacant, as though he'd never been. But I knew better. Something had changed in the bones of the house, and in me. Still, I clung to the rational explanation like a lifeline. Hallucination, I told myself. Stress, shadows, the tricks of an overworked brain. But that explanation felt as fragile as old newspaper. Winter passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Spring brought the illusion of safety. I painted walls, replaced carpet, let light in. I filled the house with plants, laughter, music, anything to anchor it back to reality. But as September of the 2nd year approached, the dread returned. It crept in slowly at first, a pressure in my chest, a tightening behind my ribs. My appetite dissolved. I began to flinch at silence. Then the cats arrived. They were transparent, barely more than ripples in the air, like heat mirages flickering just beyond the reach of focus. Always at the edge of sight. When I turned to face them directly, they would vanish. but their presence lingered. The soft thump of phantom paws on wood floors, the whisper of whiskers against skin. Unlike the man on the stairs, these cats were restless, mobile, omnipresent. They prowled through every room, leapt onto furniture that didn't respond to their weight, threaded between my legs without ever fully appearing. Their ghostly forms brushed against me in the dark, waking me each night with the eerie pressure of paws walking across my chest. I tried to adapt, but sleep became impossible. The house seemed to know. It betrayed me constantly. Motion sensor lights clicked on and off for no visible reason. Harsh LED glare sliced through the dark, illuminating nothing but the certainty that something had just been there. By mid-November, I was falling apart. I'd lost 20 pounds. My hands shook. My eyes had taken on a wide, hunted look. Strangers began to cross the street to avoid me. And then, as before, it ended. The cats faded as quietly as they had arrived. The lights stopped flickering. The floorboards ceased their phantom pattering. But their absence only confirmed one terrible truth. The house was not haunted. It was scheduled. A clockwork horror, ticking along a rhythm I could not predict, only endure. That winter, I became obsessed with the house's history. I scoured public records and newspaper archives. Built in 1923, 7 owners before me. No deaths, no crimes, no explanations. Just people who sold quickly, quietly, and disappeared. Then came year 3. My grandmother returned. She arrived on October 1st as though summoned. I found her in the kitchen, standing in front of the sink where she had spent so many hours during my childhood visits. She wore her old house dress and tattered slippers, her silver hair pulled into the tight bun I remembered. Her hunched back and knotted hands moved constantly as she muttered to herself in rapid, slurred Portuguese. She had died 15 years earlier, buried across town. I had stood at her graveside with a mix of sadness and guilt. And now, there she was, solid as memory and just as bitter, mumbling the same ceaseless stream of complaints I remembered from my childhood. She never acknowledged me, never looked at me. She just kept muttering to someone, or something, I couldn't see. The air around her was thick with that same strange static the man on the stairs had carried, as if she were suspended in a radio signal I couldn't quite tune into. I didn't dare speak to her. I wasn't sure what would happen if I did. And the general decline of everything she had voiced throughout my childhood. My chest constricted with panic as I watched her familiar movements, the way she wiped the same section of counter over and over, her mouth moving in an endless stream of grievances that death apparently hadn't silenced. When I tried to speak to her, she continued her monologue without pause, as if I didn't exist or couldn't be heard over the volume of her eternal complaints. The smell of her presence filled the kitchen, a mixture of garlic, mothballs, and the particular mustiness that had clung to her apartment in her final years. The scent triggered memories I had tried to forget. Long, uncomfortable visits where she had criticized my appearance, my life choices, my failure to visit more often. Her voice carried the same accusatory tone that had made me avoid her calls and postpone visits until guilt finally drove me to her doorstep. Night after night, she maintained her vigil in the kitchen, muttering her endless litany of complaints while wiping the same spotless counter. The sound of her voice carried through the house, a constant background noise that made concentration impossible. I found myself straining to understand her words, to decipher whether her complaints were general grievances or specific accusations directed at me from beyond the grave. Sleep became impossible with her voice echoing through the house. I tried closing bedroom doors, wearing earplugs, even camping in the backyard, but her muttering seemed to penetrate every barrier I constructed. The sound followed me everywhere, a persistent reminder of family obligations unfulfilled and conversations we would never have. My hands shook as I poured morning coffee, the cup rattling against its saucer while my grandmother's voice provided unwelcome commentary from the kitchen. Work became impossible as her complaints echoed in my head during meetings and phone calls. Colleagues noticed my distraction, my inability to focus on simple tasks, the way I flinched at sudden sounds and jumped when people approached from behind. The familiar pattern held. November 1st brought silence as my grandmother vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. But the relief felt hollow now, tainted by the growing certainty that the house was building toward something, that each annual manifestation was preparation for a final, terrible revelation. I spent year 4 in a state of constant anxiety, dreading October's arrival while obsessively trying to predict what new horror would join the growing catalog of annual visitations. The man on the stairs, the transparent cats, my grandmother's endless complaints. Each manifestation had been more invasive than the last. More personal, more impossible to ignore or rationalize away. When October came again, I was already a nervous wreck, jumping at every sound and constantly checking over my shoulder. My pulse raced whenever I approached the staircase, expecting to see the man in his charcoal suit. My peripheral vision betrayed me constantly, conjuring cat-shaped shadows that dissolved when I looked directly. The kitchen had become a minefield of memory, every glance triggering the expectation of my grandmother's familiar form hunched over the sink. But this year was different. This year, the house held its breath. The doorbell rang at 11:47 p.m. on October 15th. The sound cut through the house like a blade, sharp and insistent in the midnight stillness. My heart nearly stopped as I bolted upright in bed, every nerve ending screaming with sudden terror. The brass bell mounted beside the front door had an antique, penetrating tone that seemed to vibrate through the walls and settle in my bones. I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling while my pulse hammered in my ears. The doorbell had been broken since I moved in, a corroded mechanism that hadn't functioned in decades. Yet the sound had been unmistakable, real, impossible to dismiss as imagination or stress-induced hallucination. Silence stretched for long minutes before I forced myself to investigate. My bare feet hit the cold hardwood as I crept through the darkened house, avoiding the 7th step where the man had stood, checking corners for transparent cats, listening for the sound of my grandmother's complaints from the kitchen. Everything was quiet, exactly as it should be in a normal house at nearly midnight. The front door stood solid and unchanged, its deadbolt secure, its brass bell hanging motionless beside the frame. I pressed my face to the window, peering through lace curtains at the empty front porch and the dark street beyond. Nothing moved in the pale glow of street lamps. No cars were parked at the curb. No figures stood waiting in the shadows. But as I turned away from the window, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Wet footprints led from the front door to the center of the entryway, where they simply stopped. Not shoe prints or boot marks, but the bare human impressions of feet that had walked through water or mud. The prints were perfectly clear in the dim light filtering through the front window. 5 toes, heel, arch, all rendered in what looked like dark, viscous liquid that reflected the faint illumination. My hands shook violently as I reached for the light switch, my fingers fumbling against the wall, while my eyes remained fixed on those impossible footprints. The overhead light revealed them in horrible detail. Not water or mud, but something darker, thicker, that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The prints were fresh, still glistening, and they led directly to the spot where I was standing. The doorbell rang again. This time I watched it happen. The brass bell swayed gently on its mounting, producing that sharp, penetrating tone. Though no hand touched it, no finger pressed the button that should have been broken beyond repair. The sound echoed through the house, seeming to wake everything that had ever haunted these rooms. I could feel them stirring. The man on the stairs shifting his weight, the transparent cats beginning their restless prowling, my grandmother's voice rising from the kitchen in agitated Portuguese. But this time I knew they weren't alone. Standing at the window, I pressed my face against the glass and strained to see through the darkness beyond the porch. The street lamps cast pools of sickly yellow light on empty pavement, and the neighboring houses sat dark and silent behind their drawn curtains. Nothing moved in the visible world, yet something was there. Something that could ring doorbells and leave wet footprints. Something that existed in the space between the annual manifestations that had plagued my house. Something that had been waiting for this moment, this recognition, this final understanding of what the house had been trying to tell me. The footprints began to multiply as I watched in growing horror. New impressions appeared on the hardwood floor, not advancing toward me, but spreading outward in all directions, like a crowd gathering for some terrible ceremony. Dozens of wet prints materialized around my feet, some large, some small, some misshapen in ways that suggested they might not be entirely human. The dark liquid that formed them seemed to pulse with its own life, flowing and shifting while maintaining the basic shape of feet that had never walked on earthly ground. My breath came in sharp, painful gasps as I backed away from the growing congregation of footprints, my own bare feet slipping on the hardwood as terror made my movements clumsy and desperate. The familiar sounds of my annual visitors grew louder. The man on the stairs began to turn. The transparent cats materialized, fully visible. My grandmother's complaints rose to an angry shouting that echoed through every room. But these were no longer separate manifestations, appearing according to the house's mysterious schedule. They were gathering, responding to the call of whatever stood beyond my front door, whatever had rung the broken bell and left those wet prints as calling cards for the living. I understood then, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins, that the previous years had been preparation. The man on the stairs had been testing my perception, training me to see what shouldn't exist. The transparent cats had accustomed me to presence without substance, teaching me to accept impossibility as routine. My grandmother's endless complaints had been conditioning, preparing me to hear voices that had no living source. All of it had been leading to this moment, this gathering, this convergence of every horror the house had collected over the decades of its existence. I was not the first person to experience these annual manifestations, nor would I be the last. The house kept its own calendar, its own schedule of visitations, and I had become part of its permanent collection. The doorbell rang a third time, and this time I knew I had to answer, not because I wanted to, but because the choice was no longer mine to make. The wet footprints had surrounded me completely, forming a circle of dark impressions that seemed to pulse with anticipation. The man on the stairs had turned fully around, revealing a face that was somehow both familiar and impossible to remember. The transparent cats had arranged themselves like sentinels throughout the room, their barely visible forms creating a gauntlet I would have to pass through to reach the door. And from the kitchen, my grandmother's voice had changed, from complaints to what sounded almost like encouragement, her Portuguese words taking on a rhythm that suggested instruction, guidance, welcome. My hand reached for the deadbolt without conscious decision, my fingers turning the mechanism while my mind screamed protests that my body ignored. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the house like a bell tolling, and I knew that whatever stood beyond the door had been waiting for this moment as long as I had been dreading it. The door swung open on its own. The porch was empty, exactly as it had appeared through the window. Empty and innocent and perfectly normal in every way, except for the presence I could feel standing just beyond the threshold, waiting for permission to enter that my open door had just granted. The wet footprints on my floor began to steam, releasing vapors that carried the scent of rain and earth and something deeper, older, that might have been the smell of time itself. The house settled around me with sounds of satisfaction, creaking and sighing like something that had been holding its breath for far too long. I stepped back from the open door, but I didn't run. There was nowhere to go now. Nowhere that would be far enough from whatever had been calling the annual manifestations to my house. I was part of the collection now, part of the calendar, part of the schedule that would bring new visitors next October and the October after that. The door closed by itself with a gentle click, and the house fell silent, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant settling of ancient wood. The wet footprints had dried to dark stains on the hardwood, permanent marks that would serve as evidence of this night for whoever came next. I walked back to my bedroom on unsteady legs, past the empty seventh step, through the now quiet kitchen, beyond the corners where transparent cats no longer prowled. The house felt different now, not haunted but inhabited. Where I stood, the doorbell rang again. This time I watched it happen. The brass bell swayed gently on its mounting, producing that sharp, piercing tone, though no hand touched it, no finger pressed the button that should have been broken long ago. The sound echoed through the house, awakening everything that had ever haunted these rooms. I could feel them stirring, the man on the stairs shifting his weight, the transparent cats beginning their restless prowling, my grandmother's voice rising from the kitchen in agitated Portuguese. But this time I knew they weren't alone. Standing at the window, I pressed my face against the glass and strained to see through the darkness beyond the porch. Street lamps cast sickly yellow pools of light onto empty pavement. The neighboring houses sat dark and silent behind drawn curtains. Nothing moved in the visible world, yet something was there. Something that could ring doorbells and leave wet footprints. Something that existed in the space between the annual manifestations that had plagued my house. Something that had been waiting for this moment, this recognition, this final understanding of what the house had been trying to tell me. The footprints began to multiply as I watched in growing horror. New impressions appeared on the hardwood floor, not advancing toward me but spreading outward in all directions, like a crowd gathering for some terrible ceremony. Dozens of wet prints materialized around my feet. Some large, some small, some misshapen in ways that suggested they might not be entirely human. The dark liquid that formed them seemed to pulse with its own life, flowing and shifting while maintaining the shape of feet that had never walked on earthly ground. My breath came in sharp, painful gasps as I backed away from the growing congregation of footprints. My bare feet slipping on the hardwood, terror making my movements clumsy and desperate. The familiar sounds of my annual visitors grew louder. The man on the stairs began to turn. The transparent cats fully materialized. My grandmother's complaints rose into angry shouts that echoed through every room. But these were no longer separate manifestations appearing according to the house's mysterious schedule. They were gathering, responding to the call of whatever stood beyond my front door. Whatever had rung the broken bell and left those wet prints as calling cards for the living. I understood then, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins, that the previous years had been preparation. The man on the stairs had been testing my perception, training me to see what shouldn't exist. The transparent cats had accustomed me to presence without substance, teaching me to accept impossibility as routine. My grandmother's endless complaints had been conditioning, preparing me to hear voices that had no living source. All of it had been leading to this moment, this gathering, this convergence of every horror the house had collected over decades of existence. I was not the first to experience these annual visitations, nor would I be the last. The house kept its own calendar, its own schedule of visitations, and I had become part of its permanent collection. The doorbell rang a third time. This time I knew I had to answer, not because I wanted to, but because the choice was no longer mine. The wet footprints surrounded me completely, forming a circle of dark impressions that pulsed with anticipation. The man on the stairs turned fully around, revealing a face both familiar and impossible to remember. The transparent cats arranged themselves like sentinels throughout the room, their barely visible forms creating a gauntlet I would have to pass through to reach the door. From the kitchen, my grandmother's voice shifted from complaints to what sounded almost like encouragement, her Portuguese words taking on a rhythm of instruction, guidance, welcome. My hand reached for the deadbolt without conscious decision. My fingers turned the mechanism while my mind screamed protests that my body ignored. The lock clicked open with a sound that echoed through the house like a bell tolling. I knew that whatever stood beyond the door had been waiting for this moment as long as I had been dreading it. The door swung open on its own. The porch was empty, exactly as it had appeared through the window. Empty, innocent, and perfectly normal in every way except for the presence I could feel standing just beyond the threshold, waiting for permission to enter that my open door had just granted. The wet footprints on my floor began to steam, releasing vapors carrying the scent of rain, earth, and something deeper, older, perhaps the smell of time itself. The house settled around me with sounds of satisfaction, creaking and sighing like something that had been holding its breath for far too long. I stepped back from the open door, but I didn't run. There was nowhere to go now. Nowhere far enough from whatever had been calling the annual manifestations to my house. I was part of the collection now, part of the calendar, part of the schedule that would bring new visitors next October, and the October after that. The door closed by itself with a gentle click, and the house fell silent, except for my own ragged breathing and the distant settling of ancient wood. The wet footprints had dried to dark stains on the hardwood, permanent marks that would serve as evidence of this night for whoever came next. I walked back to my bedroom on unsteady legs, past the empty seventh step, through the now quiet kitchen, beyond the corners where transparent cats no longer prowled. The house felt different now, not haunted, but inhabited, complete, ready for next year's cycle to begin. There was something burned into the glass. When I tried to tell my grandmother what I'd seen, she dismissed it as an overactive imagination, the product of too many scary movies and not enough sleep. But I knew what I'd seen. I spent the rest of that summer avoiding the kitchen whenever possible, especially after dark. Now, sitting on the attic floor surrounded by photographic evidence that I wasn't crazy, that something had indeed left its mark on that glass door, I felt my hands shaking uncontrollably. The familiar metallic taste of copper filled my mouth. I realized I'd been biting my lip hard enough to draw blood. With trembling fingers, I gathered the photographs and made my way downstairs, each step feeling like a descent into something I wasn't prepared to face. The kitchen looked exactly as it had all those years ago. The same faded yellow wallpaper dotted with tiny flowers, the same linoleum floor worn smooth in the spots where generations of my family had walked. And there it was. The door, its glass panels catching the afternoon light filtering through the windows. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it echoing in my ears. My breathing grew shallow and rapid. I had to lean against the counter to steady myself. The stain was there, exactly as it appeared in the photographs. A dark, sinister mark, etched into the glass itself, immune to decades of scrubbing. Scratch marks around its edges betrayed attempts, probably my grandmother's, to erase it, but the stain remained as permanent as a scar. I reached out to touch it, then jerked my hand back as if burned. The glass was cold beneath my fingertips, but the area around the stain seemed to radiate a subtle warmth that made my skin crawl. Pressing my palm flat against the door, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the sensation was undeniable. That night, I stayed in my old room upstairs, telling myself I was just tired, letting my imagination run wild. But sleep was elusive. Every creak of the house sent adrenaline surging through my veins. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the old Victorian settling, its familiar groans and sighs, but beneath the aged wood's ordinary noises, I thought I heard something else. Footsteps in the kitchen below. I sat up, heart hammering against my ribs, straining to listen. The sounds were subtle, barely perceptible above the house's ambient noise, but they followed a pattern too regular to be random. Soft, measured steps pacing back and forth across the linoleum floor. My mouth went completely dry. I swallowed several times before I could wet my lips. The logical part of my mind insisted old houses made all kinds of noises, that I was hearing what I expected to hear rather than what was actually there. But my body knew better, flooding me with adrenaline that made my hands shake and my vision blur at the edges. I forced myself up to investigate, though every instinct screamed at me to stay in bed and wait for morning. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, darkness pressing in from all sides despite the moonlight filtering through the windows. Each step down the stairs felt like a betrayal of my own survival instincts. The kitchen was empty, bathed in pale silver light that made everything look ghostly and insubstantial. But the air felt different, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I moved toward the laundry room door, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The stain was glowing, not with visible light, but something else. Something my eyes could perceive but my brain couldn't process. It pulsed with a rhythm matching my accelerated heartbeat, as if connected to my very life force. I stumbled backward, legs suddenly weak, grabbing the edge of the counter to steady myself. The stain began to change. Dark edges flickered and danced, taking on the appearance of flames. The shape writhed and shifted. Gradually, features emerged from the chaotic patterns. The hollow, burning suggestion of eyes, the curve of a mouth twisted into that same knowing smile I remembered from childhood. My breathing grew rapid and shallow. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. I wanted to run, to flee the house and never return, but my legs refused to obey. I was paralyzed by terror as the thing in the glass regarded me with obvious amusement. Then it spoke, not with words but directly into my mind. Its voice was like the crackle of burning wood and the whisper of smoke through empty rooms. Told me things, revealing secrets about my family that no one else knew. My grandfather's death, which hadn't been the heart attack everyone believed. My grandmother's final days, when she spoke to empty rooms and refused to enter the kitchen after dark. The revelations came in waves, each more disturbing than the last, until I understood that the thing in the glass, something had been burned into the glass. When I tried to tell my grandmother what I'd seen, she dismissed it as an overactive imagination, the product of too many scary movies and not enough sleep. But I knew what I saw. I spent the rest of that summer avoiding the kitchen whenever possible, especially after dark. Now, sitting on the attic floor, surrounded by photographs proving I wasn't crazy, that something had indeed left its mark on that glass door, I felt my hands tremble uncontrollably. The bitter taste of copper filled my mouth, and I realized I'd been biting my lip hard enough to draw blood. With shaking fingers, I gathered the photographs and made my way downstairs, each step feeling like a descent into a nightmare I wasn't prepared to face. The kitchen looked exactly as it had all those years ago. The same yellow wallpaper patterned with tiny flowers, the same worn linoleum floor marked by generations of footsteps. There was the door, the glass panels catching the afternoon light filtering through the windows. I approached slowly, my heart pounding loud enough to echo in my ears. My breath was shallow and rapid. I had to lean against the counter to steady myself. The stain was there, exactly as it appeared in the photographs. A dark, sinister mark etched into the glass itself, impervious to decades of scrubbing. Scratch marks circled its edges where someone, probably my grandmother, had tried to erase it, but the stain remained, permanent as a scar. I reached out to touch it, then yanked my hand back as if burned. The glass was cold beneath my fingertips, but around the stain, a subtle warmth radiated, making my skin crawl. I pressed my palm flat against the door, trying to convince myself I was imagining it, but the sensation was undeniable. That night, I stayed in my old room upstairs, telling myself I was just tired, letting my imagination run wild. But sleep was impossible. Every creak in the house sent adrenaline shooting through me. I lay in bed, listening to the old Victorian settle, but beneath the familiar groans, I thought I heard something else. Footsteps in the kitchen below. I sat up, heart hammering, straining to listen. The sounds were faint, barely audible over the house's ambient noise, but they followed a pattern too deliberate to be random. Soft, measured steps pacing back and forth across the linoleum floor. My mouth went dry. I swallowed hard several times to wet my lips. The logical part of me insisted old houses made all kinds of noises, that I was hearing what I expected, not what was real. But my body knew better. Flooded with adrenaline, my hands shook, and my vision blurred. I forced myself out of bed, every instinct screaming to stay put. The hallway stretched out like a dark tunnel, pressing in from all sides despite the moonlight filtering through the windows. Each step down the stairs felt like betraying my own survival instincts. The kitchen was empty, bathed in pale silver light that made everything look ghostly and insubstantial. Yet the air felt different, charged, electric. The hair on my arms stood on end. Drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist, I moved toward the laundry room door. The stain glowed not with visible light, but something else. Something my eyes could perceive but my brain couldn't process. It pulsed in rhythm with my racing heartbeat, as if connected to my very life force. I stumbled backward, legs weak, grabbing the counter to stay upright. The stain shifted, dark edges flickering and dancing like flames. Slowly, chaotic patterns took shape. Hollow, burning eyes appeared, and a twisted mouth curled into the same knowing smile I'd seen as a child. My breathing quickened. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. I wanted to run, to flee this house and never look back. But my legs refused to obey. I was frozen, paralyzed by terror, as the thing in the glass watched me, amusement flickering in its gaze. Then it spoke, not with words but directly into my mind. Its voice was the crackle of burning wood, the whisper of smoke slipping through empty rooms. It revealed secrets, dark truths about my family no one else knew. My grandfather's death wasn't the heart attack everyone believed. My grandmother's final days, talking to empty rooms and refusing to enter the kitchen after dark, were tied to it all. The revelations came in waves, each one more disturbing than the last, until I understood. The thing in the glass had been watching, waiting, feeding on the fear and secrets of every soul who had lived in this house. It was part of the structure now, just as integral as the foundation or walls. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in that nightmarish communion. Time stretched and twisted, minutes feeling like hours, hours compressed into heartbeats. Eventually, the first pale light of dawn crept through the kitchen windows. The stain faded back to a dormant dark mark on the glass, but I knew it was still there, still watching, still waiting. That morning, I gathered my belongings with trembling hands and left, abandoning the rest of my grandmother's possessions to gather dust for another generation. But I couldn't abandon the knowledge forced into my mind, the understanding that some inheritances come with prices that can never be fully paid. The house still stands on Maple Street, waiting for the next family member to return. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I can feel it calling to me across the miles. A reminder that I can run, but I can never truly escape what burns in the glass of that laundry room door. The stain remains, patient and eternal. A window between worlds that someone in my bloodline will eventually have to face. Some debts pass from generation to generation, and some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. I've moved across the country, changed my name, tried to build a new life free from that house's shadow. But every reflection in glass quickens my heart. Every flicker of flame in my peripheral vision sends ice down my spine. Because I know the truth now, the terrible inheritance waiting for me in that small town where my roots run deep and dark. The thing in the glass isn't gone. It's waiting, growing stronger every year, feeding on fear across the miles. Someday, whether I want to or not, I'll have to go back. Blood calls to blood, and debts must be paid. Until then, I avoid mirrors after dark, never looking too closely at window reflections. Because sometimes, when the light hits just right, I see that familiar smile staring back, patient and eternal, reminding me that some stains can never be washed away. It was the way the shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, sliding across surfaces with a liquid fluidity that defied logic. The persistent feeling of being watched gnawed at us, eyes tracking our every movement from places where no eyes should exist. Danny noticed it too, though he tried to hide his unease behind forced laughter and overly casual jokes about how creepy old houses always had their quirks. I caught him checking locks obsessively and jumping at sounds that hadn't been there moments before. The others, however, seemed genuinely unaffected. They treated our growing paranoia like entertainment, making jokes about ghost hunters and suggesting we document everything for social media. The second night brought more vivid dreams. I found myself wandering through the house in total darkness, but the layout was all wrong. Hallways stretched impossibly longer than they should. Doors opened onto rooms that didn't exist, and everywhere I turned I glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision. Quick, furtive motions that vanished the moment I focused on them. I woke with my heart hammering against my ribs, my body slick with cold sweat, and the absolute certainty that I hadn't been dreaming at all. Danny's bed was empty. I found him standing motionless at the kitchen window facing the woods. His posture was wrong, too rigid, too still, like a statue, not a person. When I called his name, he turned with mechanical precision, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He told me he'd been watching something moving between the trees, something walking upright but not quite human. His voice carried no emotion, as if he were commenting on the weather or the coffee. The way he spoke sent ice down my spine. I looked outside, but saw only darkness and vague outlines of tree trunks. I managed to convince him to return to bed, though he moved with that same eerie precision, as if a marionette guided by invisible strings. He claimed no memory of the incident the next morning, insisting he'd slept soundly through the night. By the third day, the house felt actively hostile. Temperature fluctuations became extreme and localized. We'd walk from stifling heat into pockets of Arctic cold within a few steps. The scratching inside the walls evolved into more complex sounds. Rhythmic tapping, muffled thuds, and occasionally whispered conversations just below the threshold of comprehension. Marcus and Jake maintained their skepticism, growing irritated and suggesting Danny, and I were feeding off each other's paranoia and ruining the weekend for everyone. Their dismissal felt genuine, which somehow made everything worse. Either they truly couldn't perceive what we were experiencing, or something was selectively targeting us. I began documenting everything obsessively, photographing objects before and after their mysterious relocations, recording the strange sounds with my phone, measuring temperature variations. But the evidence was always inconclusive. Shadows looked normal in photos, recordings captured only silence or ordinary house noises. Temperature readings showed minimal variation. The disconnect between experience and evidence felt like gaslighting by reality itself. Sleep became increasingly elusive. I'd lie awake listening to the house breathe around us, convinced something moved through the walls, learning our patterns, studying our vulnerabilities. When exhaustion finally claimed me, my dreams were invaded by a presence ancient and malevolent, something that had waited in that house far longer than any of us had lived. On the fourth night, everything changed. I woke not to sound, but to sensation. A slow, deliberate pressure around my ankle, cold and firm like fingers made of ice and steel. My eyes snapped open. In the dim light filtering through the grimy window, I saw it. The creature stood at the foot of my bed, its skeletal hand wrapped around my ankle with possessive certainty. It was impossibly thin, as if constructed from shadows and spiderwebs. Its gray skin stretched tight over a frame suggesting starvation taken to the extreme. Its limbs were too long, jointed in places that defied anatomy. And its face, God, its face was the worst part. Its eyes were black holes absorbing light rather than reflecting it. When it smiled, its mouth opened far wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that gleamed wetly in the darkness. But it was the expression that paralyzed me. Pure malicious joy, like a child who had just discovered a new toy to break. The thing began to retreat toward the door, not in fear or haste, but with deliberate showmanship, like a performer taking a bow. At the doorway, it struck its back against the wooden frame in a rhythmic celebration. Thump, thump, thump. Each impact measured and intentional. A victory dance performed by a predator who had successfully completed its hunt. The sound echoed through the house with the finality of a death knell, and I understood with crystalline clarity that whatever had stalked us during our stay had finally made its move. My body refused to obey my desperate commands to move or scream. I lay there, paralyzed, watching as the nightmare congratulated itself on my terror. The paralysis was complete and absolute, as if every muscle had been severed from my nervous system. I could only observe as the creature's celebration continued, its skeletal frame contorting in agonizing ways to witness. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The doorway stood empty, but the echoes of its celebration seemed to reverberate through the walls themselves, absorbed into the very structure of the house like a stain that would never fade. I don't know how long I lay there. I lay there, waiting for my body to remember how to move again. When sensation finally returned to my limbs, I scrambled across the room to Danny's bed, only to find it empty and cold, as if untouched for hours. The sheets were pulled tight, hospital corner perfect. That made no sense. I'd seen him climb in just hours before. The house around me had shifted. It thrummed with an energy that made my skin crawl. Every shadow grew darker, every sound sharper, and the very air felt thick with something malevolent. I crept toward Marcus and Jake's room, my bare feet silent against the cold floorboards. Their door stood wide open. Their beds, too, were empty, sheets pulled taut, pristine. The silence swallowed the whole house. It felt like a tomb. I called their names, but my voice was swallowed by the walls mere feet from me. I searched every room, every closet, every hiding place, but found nothing. Their belongings remained untouched. Car keys on the kitchen counter, phones charging by their beds. It was as if they had vanished, leaving only artifacts behind, like relics of a lost civilization. My mind scrambled for rational explanations. An early morning walk, a trip to town, an elaborate prank. But my body knew better. My hands trembled uncontrollably. My breaths came shallow and sharp, never enough air. My heart pounded against my ribs like a caged animal desperate to escape. I tried to leave, but the car refused to start. The engine turned over but caught nothing, like something essential was missing or broken. My phone had no signal. The screen flickered with static whenever I tried to call out. The landline on the kitchen wall answered only with dead silence when I lifted the receiver. The house had become a prison, and I was its last occupant, or so I thought. As the day wore on, I realized I wasn't alone. Sounds echoed from rooms I had just searched. Footsteps padded upstairs. Doors creaked closed in distant hallways. Whispered voices hovered just beneath understanding. Whenever I investigated, there was nothing, but the sounds persisted, always just out of reach, suggesting presence without proof. I barricaded myself in the living room as night fell, shoving furniture against the doors and windows with a desperate strength I didn't know I had. But the barriers meant nothing to whatever haunted this place. The voices grew clearer. Marcus laughing just beyond hearing, Jake planning tomorrow, Danny talking about strange dreams. They were here somewhere inside the house, but they had changed. Their voices remained, but their essence was gone. The realization hit me like a blow. The creature I'd seen hadn't been hunting us. It had been recruiting us. As darkness settled, the familiar nocturnal sounds of the house stirring came alive, and I understood my choice was simple. Resist and slowly lose my mind as reality unraveled, or surrender and join whatever my friends had become. Then the gray creature appeared in the doorway. It didn't approach or threaten. It simply stood there, framed by darkness, its skeletal form outlined and still. Its wide mouth curled into that same predatory grin, eyes like black holes reflecting my terror. Behind it, I saw the distorted shadows of my friends. Familiar silhouettes beckoning me, their voices warm and affectionate. But beneath it all lurked something hungry and inhuman, wearing their faces like masks. The creature's celebration hadn't been about catching me. It was about completing its collection, the final piece in a horrifying puzzle it had been assembling far longer than I could imagine. The thing wearing Marcus's face stepped forward, speaking in the voice I remembered, telling me how wonderful it was here, how free they all felt, urging me to stop fighting and join them. But those empty eyes matched the creature's voids, and when it smiled, rows of needle-sharp teeth glinted in the darkness. I don't remember deciding to run. One moment I was staring into those alien faces. The next I was crashing through the barricaded window, glass cutting into my arms and face as I tumbled onto the porch. The woods called to me, a promise of escape, but I could hear them following. Not running, but walking, steady and sure they'd find me no matter where I hid. I ran through the darkness, branches tearing at my skin and clothes, my bare feet bruised by every sharp stone and twisted root. Behind me, their voices called my name, patient, persistent, never fading, as if the forest itself carried their words. I don't know how long I ran or how I finally found the road. When the headlights of a passing truck caught me, I must have looked like a nightmare, bloodied, wild-eyed, stumbling in torn pajamas. The driver took me to the nearest hospital. I spent 3 days under observation while the police investigated my story. They found the house empty and undisturbed. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, and no trace of my friends, except for their belongings, which remained exactly where they'd been left. The official report concluded that Marcus, Jake, and Danny had abandoned me after some kind of prank gone wrong, though it couldn't explain why they'd left their wallets, phones, and car behind. I know better. Sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, I can still hear their voices calling my name. They sound so much like my friends that I almost answer, almost give in to the temptation to join them in whatever they've become. But then I remember the gray creature's celebration, the way it struck its back against the doorframe in triumphant rhythm, and I force myself fully awake. The house still stands. According to property records, it's been rented dozens of times since our visit, always to groups of friends looking for a weekend escape, always at that same impossibly low price. I've tried to warn people, tried to contact rental sites and local authorities, but my reputation as someone who abandoned his friends and suffered a psychotic break makes my warnings easy to dismiss. I live alone now in a studio apartment on the 10th floor of a building where every wall is shared with neighbors, where I'm never truly isolated, never completely alone. I check locks obsessively and sleep with every light in the apartment burning bright. I've developed rituals and safeguards, ways to anchor myself to reality when the whispers start. But they're getting stronger, more insistent. Sometimes, in the reflection of my bathroom mirror or the dark surface of my television screen, I catch glimpses of movement that shouldn't be there. Skeletal figures dancing in celebration, and familiar faces watching me with eyes like black holes, waiting for the moment my defenses finally crumble. The gray creature got what it wanted that night. It collected my friends and added them to its menagerie of willing servants. But it left me behind for a reason, and I'm beginning to understand what that reason might be. I'm not the one who got away. I'm the bait for the next group. 5. Some streets swallow sound differently after dark. Maple Avenue was one of those streets, the kind where footsteps echoed too long, and shadows seemed to breathe with a life of their own. I'd walked this route every evening for 3 months. Yet tonight felt different. The air hung thick with the promise of something wrong, something that made my skin crawl before I even understood why. The routine had become sacred to me. Every day, at exactly 6:15, I'd leave the office and take the long way home down Maple Avenue. It wasn't the fastest route, that would have been the main road, with its honking traffic and fluorescent-lit storefronts. But I preferred the quiet residential stretch. Rows of modest houses with small front yards, and the kind of silence that let me decompress from another day of corporate numbness. That's where I first noticed him. The house sat third from the corner, distinguished by nothing except its ordinariness. Faded blue siding, a chain-link fence that had seen better decades, and a side window that faced directly onto the sidewalk. Through that window, every single evening, I could see him washing dishes. At first, it seemed unremarkable. A middle-aged man in a gray shirt standing at what must have been his kitchen sink, methodically scrubbing plates and cups. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic. Lift the dish, scrub in circular motions, rinse, place in the drying rack. The same sequence performed with the dedication of a monk at prayer. I found myself looking forward to seeing him. There was something oddly comforting about the consistency. The proof that somewhere in this chaotic world someone maintained their small corner of order week after week. As autumn deepened into early winter, he was always there, always washing, always following the same mechanical pattern. But gradually, I began to notice things that made my steps slow as I approached his window. The first peculiarity was the timing. No matter what time I walked by, whether I left work early at 5:30 or stayed late until 7, he was always washing dishes. Always in the middle of his routine, never beginning, never finishing. It struck me as odd that anyone would have such a perfectly timed schedule, or that anyone would have quite so many dishes to wash on a daily basis. The second thing I noticed was his posture. He never looked up, never glanced around, never exhibited any of the small, unconscious movements people make when they think they're alone. His focus on the dishes was absolute, unwavering, almost supernatural in its intensity. I'd seen people concentrate before, but this was different. This was the kind of focus that suggested nothing else in the world existed. Then came the evening when I realized he was always washing the same plate. I'd slowed my pace without thinking, drawn by some instinct I couldn't name. The streetlight cast just enough illumination through his window for me to see the dish in his hands. A white ceramic plate with a thin blue border. As I watched, he scrubbed it with the same circular motions, lifted it to inspect it, then returned it to the soapy water to begin again, the same plate, the same motions over and over. My heart began beating faster than it should have. There was something deeply wrong about watching someone trapped in such a perfect loop, something that made my mouth go dry and my palms sweat. I forced myself to keep walking, but the image burned in my mind for the rest of the evening. The next night, I told myself I wouldn't look. I'd walk past quickly, eyes straight ahead, and put the strange man out of my thoughts entirely. But as I approached the house, my gaze was drawn to the window like iron to a magnet. He was there, of course, still watching, still focused with that unsettling intensity. But tonight, something was different. Tonight he was smiling, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was more like a grimace stretched across his face, all teeth and no warmth. His lips were pulled back far enough to show his gums, and his eyes, what little I could see of them in profile, seemed too wide, too bright. He scrubbed the plate with the same mechanical motions, but that horrible smile never wavered. I actually stumbled, on the sidewalk and had to catch myself against a telephone pole. My hands shook as I pressed my palms against the cold metal, trying to steady myself. When I looked back at the window, his head had turned slightly in my direction. Not fully, not enough to see me clearly, but enough for me to make out more of that twisted smile, enough to see that his eyes were indeed too wide, too bright, too focused. He wasn't looking at me, not exactly, but he was aware of my presence in a way that made every nerve in my body scream at me to run. Instead, I walked quickly. My breathing had become shallow and rapid, each exhale forming small clouds in the cold air behind me. I could feel his attention like a weight between my shoulder blades, heavy, warm, and completely wrong. For the next few days, I took a different route home, but avoidance only made the obsession worse. I found myself thinking about him during meetings, during lunch, during the commute to work. The image of that smile haunted me. Worse than that was the growing certainty that I'd somehow become part of his routine, just as he'd become part of mine. The thought made me feel sick, dizzy with a fear I couldn't rationally explain. When I finally returned to Maple Avenue, almost a week later, I told myself I needed to prove that my imagination had run away with me, that I'd blown a perfectly innocent situation out of proportion. People smiled while doing household chores all the time. There was nothing sinister about washing dishes, no matter how many times someone might scrub the same plate. But as I approached his house, my body betrayed me. My heart rate spiked, my palms grew slick with sweat, and my mouth became so dry I could barely swallow. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to turn around, to run, to never come down the street again. He was there, of course he was, but tonight the smile was gone. Tonight, his head was turned toward the window, toward me, and his eyes were locked on mine with an intensity that made my vision blur around the edges. He wasn't washing anymore. The plate hung forgotten in his hands, dripping soapy water onto what must have been his kitchen floor. His entire body was oriented toward the window, toward me, and his mouth was moving. I couldn't hear what he was saying through the glass, but I could see his lips forming words over and over, the same phrase repeated with increasing urgency. His eyes never left mine, never blinked, never showed any recognition of me as a human being rather than an object of fascination. My legs felt like water. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I could only stand there, frozen on the sidewalk, watching him mouth his silent words while his stare burned into me like acid. Time seemed to stretch and distort, seconds feeling like hours until finally I managed to force my feet to move. I walked past his house quickly, my entire body shaking with adrenaline and terror, but I could feel him watching me go. I could sense his attention following me down the street like a searchlight. When I finally reached the corner and turned onto the main road, I allowed myself to look back. He was no longer at the window. The kitchen appeared empty, just a sink full of soapy water catching the reflection of the streetlight. But somehow that was worse than seeing him there. Where had he gone? What was he doing? Was he still watching me from somewhere I couldn't see? I ran the rest of the way home that night. I barely slept. Every shadow in my apartment seemed to move. Every creak of the building settling sounded like footsteps. I kept thinking about his eyes, about the way they'd locked onto mine with such predatory focus. I'd felt like prey, like something being studied and evaluated by a predator deciding when to strike. The next evening I took a taxi home, and the evening after that. For almost 2 weeks I avoided Maple Avenue entirely, taking various routes that added time and money to my commute but kept me away from that house, away from him. But avoidance wasn't sustainable. The taxi rides were expensive, and the alternative routes took me through parts of the city I liked even less than I'd grown to fear Maple Avenue. Eventually, I reluctantly convinced myself that I was being ridiculous. The man was probably harmless, probably didn't even remember seeing me. My imagination had inflated a few uncomfortable moments into something far more sinister than reality warranted. So, on a Thursday evening in late November, as the sun was beginning its early winter descent toward the horizon, I found myself walking down Maple Avenue again. The street lights flickered on, casting their harsh yellow glow across the pavement. The cold air made my breath visible, and dry leaves crunched beneath my feet with each step. Everything felt normal, too normal. Just a quiet residential street in the early evening. Nothing threatening except the creeping approach of winter. His house came into view. I braced myself and glanced quickly at the kitchen window as I passed, forcing myself to believe he was just a regular person doing regular things. The window was dark. No light, no figure at the sink. Only a black void behind the glass. Something about that emptiness felt worse than seeing him there. I slowed, almost without meaning to, peering into the darkness. Had he moved? Changed his routine? Was he even still living here? Shapes blurred inside. The sink, a drying rack, but no dishes, no soap. No sign of life in that kitchen for a long time. I was nearly in front of the house when I saw him. Not in the window, but standing just beyond the chain-link fence, about 10 feet from the sidewalk. Perfectly still in the gathering dusk, his face half hidden by shadows, but I saw his eyes, those same wide, unnervingly bright eyes locked on me with deadly focus. My blood ran cold. In his hands he held something white and round, the plate. The same plate I'd watched him scrub obsessively for months. But he wasn't washing it now. He gripped it like a sacred relic, the most precious thing in the world. We stared at each other across the small distance, me frozen like a deer caught in headlights. The silence thickened, pressing against my skin, making my heart pound so loud I thought it would burst. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised the plate above his head. Time stretched thin, each second an eternity. His eyes never left mine. With a sudden, violent motion, he hurled it down. The ceramic shattered, shards exploding across the dead grass like broken teeth catching the sickly streetlight. He didn't even look down at the wreckage. His gaze stayed locked on me, and that horrible smile returned. All teeth, no warmth. Then he began moving toward me. Not running, not walking, but a strange loping gait that covered ground faster than it should. His arms swung with mechanical precision, his smile unwavering, his eyes burning holes through me. "Boys don't smile at strangers," he called out, his voice eerie and sing-song, like a nursery rhyme twisted into something sinister. "Boys don't smile at strangers." Terror slammed into me like a physical blow. My body convulsed with adrenaline. My vision narrowed until all I saw was him closing in. All I heard was that chant, repeating like a dark spell. My legs remembered how to move, and I ran harder than I ever had. My lungs burned, muscles screamed, but fear lent me impossible strength. Behind me, his footsteps echoed. Steady, unnatural, relentless. "Boys don't smile at strangers. Boys don't smile at strangers." His voice grew louder, more frenzied, becoming a nightmare soundtrack echoing off the houses, filling the night with menace. I didn't dare look back. I sprinted toward the main avenue, toward the lights, the noise, the safety of normal life. The intersection loomed, traffic lights, passing cars, the comforting hum of the city. I waved frantically at a car, calling for help. One stopped, a taxi. I threw myself inside, gasping directions to get me far away. As we pulled away, I stole a glance back. Maple Avenue lay quiet, empty, no sign of him. Just a peaceful street bathed in yellow light, as ordinary as any other. But I knew the truth. I knew what I'd heard. "Boys don't smile at strangers." The words echoed relentlessly in my mind during the taxi ride, through the sleepless night that followed, and in every quiet moment for weeks afterward. I never returned to Maple Avenue. Instead, I found a new route home, one that added 20 minutes to my commute, but took me through well-lit streets bustling with pedestrians. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if he's still there, still standing in that yard, waiting, still clutching broken shards of ceramic plates, still wearing that awful smile, still whispering that strange, eerie warning about boys and strangers, and the danger in simple human acknowledgement. I asked myself what his words meant. Had I smiled at him? During those long weeks of watching, had some unconscious flicker of curiosity or kindness sparked his obsession? Or was his madness rooted deeper, in something that had nothing to do with me? The questions haunt me, but not as much as the certainty I gained that night, that I glimpsed something fundamentally wrong lurking beneath the surface of ordinary life. Something patient and waiting, ready to transform a quiet evening walk into a nightmare that would shadow me for the rest of my days. I don't walk down silent residential streets anymore. I stick to main roads, to places alive with crowds and noise and the comforting chaos of normal human activity. Because now I know, for somewhere out there, in houses that look perfectly innocent from the outside, there are people endlessly washing the same plate over and over, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to care, waiting to remind us all that boys, men, should never, ever smile at strangers. The sound of wood against wood became the metronome of my sleepless nights, a rhythmic creaking counting down toward something I couldn't name but felt drawing closer with each hour. I first noticed Mr. Garrison 3 weeks after moving into the small rental on Elm Street. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where retirees tended their gardens and families walked their dogs on a reliable schedule. My bedroom window faced his backyard, giving me a clear view of his screened porch, where he spent evenings. At first, it seemed innocent enough. An elderly man in a rocking chair, enjoying the cool night air. But soon, I realized his chair faced my window with an unsettling precision. Even in darkness, his silhouette rocked steadily, hour after hour, well past midnight. The first time I caught him watching me, my pulse spiked with that instinctive jolt of danger before the mind fully comprehends. I was changing for bed when I sensed eyes on me. I looked toward the porch. There he was, a dark figure rocking slowly. Though shadows obscured his face, I knew with absolute certainty he was looking directly at me. My hands trembled as I yanked the curtains closed. My heart hammered wildly. Sleep became a stranger. Night after night, I lay listening to that relentless creaking, knowing he was out there watching even through drawn curtains. The sound seeped through walls and into my skull until I pressed my pillow hard over my ears, desperate for silence. Still, I could feel his presence, a weight pressing down on my chest. I began timing his vigil. He appeared around sunset and stayed until early morning. No variation, no breaks for meals or the bathroom. The rocking never stopped, as if he and the chair were one. During the day, I caught glimpses of him tending his garden through the kitchen window, moving with the measured gait of an ordinary old man. But something about his motions felt rehearsed, deliberate. He often glanced up at my house, as if to check whether I was watching him watch me. My throat was always dry. Every night I double-checked the locks. The feeling of being observed had infected my life, even in daylight when logic told me he couldn't possibly see through walls. Yet I felt exposed, vulnerable. I considered confronting him, but a primal instinct held me back. Something about the whole situation made my skin crawl. The thought of knocking on his door filled me with dread. Then the first stone came. It was a late October Tuesday night. I lay awake, ears straining for the creak. Suddenly, tap, 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 sharp fingers rapping on my bedroom window. My body froze, every muscle tense with fight or flight. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. I forced myself up, legs shaking, peered through a curtain gap. The porch was empty. The rocking chair sat still for the first time in weeks. At my feet lay a smooth reverse stone, about the size of a golf ball. Jagged letters were carved into its surface. I see you. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped it. The scratches looked fresh, made with something sharp and purposeful. Holding that message from my watcher, I felt the ground shift beneath me, my reality slipping just off its axis. I barely slept that night, jumping at every noise, convinced